Welcome everybody to Judaism 201. We have an exciting two-parter today that, if I've timed it right, will end on a good cliffhanger. The story of Tamar. Tamar is in chapter 38 of Sefer Bereishit, the story of Yehudah and Tamar. Before we discuss that, I just want to review where we are. The parsha itself is coming up in a couple of weeks. I want to review where chapter 38 is. Chapter 37 through the end of Sefer Bereishit is all the story arc of Yosef and his brothers. It really starts in chapter 37, where we read the story. That's when we're introduced to all the family dynamics. We're introduced where he was a child of his old age, and he made him a coat of many colors, the pasuk says. So Yosef's growing up. Some people say he was a bit spoiled. He has these dreams of the sheaves of wheat bowing down to him, and he's got no problem sharing that dream with his brothers. And then the pasuk says, quote, who then hated him even more for his talk. Wow. Brotherly hatred. And then he shares, then he goes and shares a second dream where 11 stars in the sun and the moon are all bowing down to him. And even his father seemed to be a bit perturbed about that. So as we know the story, again, this is all in chapter 37 so far. The Yosef brothers throw him into a pit. And while he's in the pit, they sit down and have a meal. They sell him to traders, and Yosef ends up with Potiphar, who is an assistant or a courtier of Paro. And then chapter 37 ends, and chapter 39 takes up the story again of Yosef and Potiphar's wife, and Yosef being thrown into prison, getting out, interpreting Paro's dreams, and all that. Okay, so that's what's going on in chapter 37 and in 39. In chapter 38, the story is suddenly interrupted by a completely different story, and that is of Yehudah and Tamar. So personally, when I first read it, when I was old enough and paid attention to stories in the Bible, when I first read it, the two obvious and immediate questions that came to me are, first of all, what's the story doing here? How does it relate to anything? And secondly, why isn't anybody punished or not a bad word is said about anybody over the deceptions and relations between a father-in-law and the daughter-in-law, and nobody seems to criticize anything there. So that really got me hooked into understanding Torah narratives a lot deeper. This was like the first story I've ever really got into and started really exploring, and it turned me on to the whole idea of paying attention a lot more to the narratives in Torah. So I've now come like a total 180 view of that Yehudah and Tamar story. It's essential. It's a linchpin, and it needs to be where it is. It's artfully interwoven, and not only should we not criticize Tamar, but Tamar is actually the unsung heroine of all of Sefer Bereishit and the entire Jewish people. It's the turning point of both the family of Israel and the entire book of Bereishit. So that's what we're going to discuss, and we're going to try this going through pasuk by pasuk and look at some of the deeper layers that are very easy to miss. In part, it's easy to miss because we usually read it in English, and there's a lot there in the Hebrew. Let me try a share screen here. Here we go. I grabbed this off of Safaria, and so I have to say right off the bat, I don't like their English translation. I'm sure they licensed it from somewhere, so they didn't have a chance. They didn't have a choice in the matter. But where I don't like the Hebrew and the English, and it's important, I'll point that out. So comes actually the fourth word. So in the Hebrew, it says, Vahi be'es hahi vayered Yehudah. The English there says, around that time, Yehudah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite whose name is Hira. The fourth word in the Hebrew is vayered. It's vayered Yehudah, which translates as Yehudah went down. It's not just that he left his brothers, it's that he went down. And of course, all the commentators pick up on that. The Ramban notes that this indicates that Yehudah has spiritually gone down. It was, after all, Yehudah was the one who suggested that Yosef be sold to the traders. It's a whole big to-do if you think about it. Was that a good thing or a bad thing? On one hand, maybe he saved Yehudah's life. On the other hand, Yehudah was lost for the next 20 years living in Mitzrayim. In any event, so Yehudah went down, I think, is the important part of the first pasuk there. The second pasuk. Yehudah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he married her and had relations with her. So that pasuk is pretty striking for a number of reasons. So first of all, from Yehudah seeing a woman to having relations with her seems to happen pretty quickly. He sees her, he marries her, he has relations with her. And the fact that he saw her as opposed to met her seems to indicate maybe that this is some sort of superficial union that's based on the skin-deep beauty of Shua's daughter. Even more striking is we see in Yehudah's ancestors, Yitzhak and Avraham, how careful they were not to allow their children to marry Canaanites. And here we are, Yehudah is just going off and marrying a daughter of a certain Canaanite. I mean, even Esav wouldn't marry a Canaanite. Well, after his father Yitzhak said, please don't marry a Canaanite, he went off and married one or two, I forget, other women who were not Canaanites. So that's a little bit surprising. Now, in Yehudah's defense, it's not entirely clear that Canaanite actually means Canaanite. So what do I mean by that? Canaanite also has another translation. It also connotes being a merchant. And it's not clear whether the Canaanites were called Canaanites because a lot of them were merchants, or vice versa. So let me give you an example. So when we look at maps, we look as though north is in front of us. And when we think of left and right, we think left and right means west and east. Okay, fine. And north is always at the top. In the Middle East, the east was considered the main direction. So the east is where the sun rose. And we see that in fact, what's interesting is somebody pointed out to me, the whole idea of, I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the phrase orienteering, like the orient means east. Orienteering means, or getting oriented is a vestige from this time when east was the primary direction. And so you try to figure out where east is, and then you figure out where all the other directions are. One of the words in Hebrew for right is yamin, and that's where the word Yemen comes from, or the country Yemen comes from. So the Yemenites were people that lived, if you look on a map, to the right-hand side. So they lived in the right-hand side before they were Yemenites. or before we called them that. So it's possible. So it's not clear whether Kanani here means that he was actually a Canaanite, or the woman was actually a Canaanite, or that he was a traitor. And in fact, in Eishes Chayil, we have a line that I can't think of it off the top of my head. There's a line that says Kanani, and it clearly means merchant. If you look in your NCSY bencher on page 9, where Eishes Chayil is, right, it says Kanani, and it's translated as merchant. So maybe Yehudah did not marry a Kanani. Maybe he did. It's not clear. So that's to give him the benefit of the doubt. Okay, so Psukim 3 and 4 happened pretty quickly, and I don't have a problem with the translation. So she conceived and bore him a son. He named him Ur. He conceived again and bore him a son and named him Onan. Although there is something that is interesting here, that Yehudah named the first son, and she named the second son. We'll see if that is relevance. We'll see that does have relevance. And Onan is a name. When you're an Onan, is a time of intense mourning, right? Or technically, it's the time. It's the time between the death and the burial. It's not even mourning time. It's a very intense time. So there may be some sort of wordplay going on there. And the reason why I say that, and the reason why I just said everything I did in the last 2 sentences, is from the next pasuk. Once again, she bore him a son and named him Shelah, and he was at Cheziv when she bore him. So let's look at the progression. First of all, the first of these 3 psukim. So first of all, the first son he named, Yehudah named. The second son, the wife named. And the third son, Yehudah wasn't even in town when the baby came, which might indicate that he's getting further separated from his family. The other thing that cries out for noting is that Chaziv, which is the name, or he was at Chaziv when she bore him, is that Chasiv comes from the Hebrew word for deceit, to lie. So there's a whole lot of wordplay going on here. All right. Let us move to the next page here. Let's do 6 and 7. Yehudah got a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar, who is going to be the either the harlot or the heroine or both of our story. Pasuk 7, but Yehudah's firstborn was displeasing to the Lord, and the Lord took his wife. One thing that's striking is that there is, the Ramban notes that there is no other case of a child dying in the families of Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. This is the only, in the house of the patriarchs, is the only time that happens. Let's see, 8 and 9. Then Yehudah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty with your brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. You're probably aware of levirate marriage. When a brother dies and there are no children, then the wife needs to marry the brother to carry on the family name. Nowadays, we do not do that. We do chalitza, which is a ceremony, saying that the woman rejects that. And it actually happens to this day. Occasionally, a person needs to do chalitza in a tragic case where the circumstances arise. And then we get to Pasuk 9, but Onan, knowing that his seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. So this was the big sin here. And let me just let's just look at one more pasuk, and then we'll talk about that. What he did was displeasing to the Lord, and he took his life also. So onanism, if you look in a modern dictionary in English and maybe in other languages too, is a sin relating to masturbation. But we see that that's not why Onan was killed here. It was on account of, and possibly it's not even the fact that he wasted seed, so to speak. It's the fact that he directly violated Hashem's command of levirate marriage, or whatever existed for levirate marriage back then, and or Yehudah's command. He was told his job was to have children with Tamar, and he intentionally did not do that. So in a sense, we see here a kind of, I don't know, poetic justice, divine retribution, mida keneged mida, so to speak. Yehudah is suffering the same pain that he helped cause his own father, right? Because of what they did with Yosef, Yehudah's father, Yaakov, thought that he had lost a son and could not be consoled. So Yaakov thinks he lost a son, and now Yehudah has lost a son. He's lost two sons. So let's see, verse 11. Then Yehudah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, "Stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelach grows up," for he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house. Yehudah, for obvious reasons, is fiercely protective now of Shelah, his youngest son, just as Yaakov was fiercely protective of his youngest son, Yosef. Later on, Binyamin is born and he becomes the youngest son. But right now, Yosef is his youngest son, and Yaakov thinks that he has lost his youngest son, and he's fiercely protective of him. And now Yehudah is fiercely protective of his youngest son. So the question arises here: is Yehudah deceiving Tamar? Because he said, you go and stay in your father's house, and when my third son grows up, then you can get together. So first of all, it was really his responsibility for Tamar. Tamar should have been staying in Yehudah's house. And second of all, was Yehudah deceiving her? And remember where Yehudah was when the third son was born. He was staying in Cheziv. Cheziv means deceit. So clearly, Yehudah thinks that Tamar is at fault for his children's deaths. And one thing that's interesting here is that Tamar never protests, and she never explains what and Onan did and why they died. Verse 12. A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Yehudah, died. It's interesting that Yehudah's wife is never married. I don't have any good explanation for that. When his period of mourning was up, Yehudah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers together with his friend Hira the Adulamite. So let's see. In the Hebrew, I'm looking for a word. Vayinachem means comforted, and the phrase is usually means when the mourning period was over. Right, when his period of mourning was over, Yehudah went up to Timnah, to his sheep bearers, to the sheep shearing festival. So what's interesting about that word is that in chapter 37, this is a direct contrast to chapter 37, when Yaakov was told about his son Yosef, and he thought that Yosef was eaten by lions. It says that Yaakov was inconsolable. So there, and it seems as though Yaakov just stayed in mourning forever, and I mean until for years and years at least. So what's interesting here is that it seems like when Yehudah, as soon as the mourning period was up, Yehudah was like out to party with Timnah and the sheep shearing festival. And this Chira the Adulamite, I mean, when was the last time he hung out with Chira the Adulamite? It's when he saw his wife, took her, and had relations with her. So there seems to be a hint of maybe of what's on Yehudah's mind here. Chira the Adulamite is the kind of guy that your parents told you to stay away from when you were in high school. If you know what I mean. So when his mourning periods is over, he said, "Hey, let's go to the sheep shearing festival, and let's get together with my buddy Chira, and let's go." Verse 13, Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing." And another instance, a reference to mourning, says she took off her widow's garb. So here we have yet another contrast of Yehudah, who is, as soon as his mourning period's over, it seems like he wants to go to the festival. And you have Tamar, who, right, what it said many years later, is that what it said? A long time afterward in verse 12. But we know it's many years later. She's still wearing her widow's garb. She covered her face with a veil, wrapping himself up, sat down at the entrance to Anayim. We'll talk about that word in a minute. Well, we'll talk about it now. Anayim means eyes, a pair of eyes, which is on the road to Timnah. For she saw that Shelah was grown up, and yet she had not been giving him to his wife. So, again, that contrast of Tamar taking things seriously, taking her mourning seriously, versus Yehudah, who's going up to the sheep shearing festival. When Yehudah saw her, he took her for a harlot, for she had covered her face. I think here I think the verb to see might be important. That the last time Yehudah was with Chira is when he saw this woman and married her and had relations with her. And here we sort of see the same pattern again. Vayireh, Yehudah saw her and thought she was a harlot. And let's look at the Hebrew there. Lizona, so he thought she was a prostitute because she had covered his face. Verse 16. So he turned aside by her in the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she says, "What will you pay me?" Yehudah is, he sees something he wants, and he directly engages into a business transaction here. There's no pleasantries going on. Verse 17, he replied, "I'll send you a kid from my flock." But she said, "You have to leave me a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What should I give you?" Verse 18, "Your seal and your cord, and the staff with which you carry." So he gave them to her, and he slept with her, and she conceived by him. So this vayavo eleha were the same two words that were used the last time he was with Chira and saw a woman. So he's thinking it's the same kind of thing. Clearly, there's an intentional allusion going there. The other thing that's striking about that verse is that Yehudah was awfully quick to give away the symbolic trappings of his identity. The seal and the cord and the staff at that time were terribly important. It was part of your identity. It was like, giving up your credit card and driver's license. It was part of your identity. Your seal and your cord, that's what you use to write when you write a letter and you stamp your seal in it. And if you think back, it sort of recalls when Esav was a bit too quick to give up his identity for immediate physical pleasure. In that case, it was his birthright for a bowl of red soup. And contrast this to, when Yaakov's on his deathbed, he gives a blessing, and in part of his blessing, this will come in later on in Sefer Bereishit in chapter 49, when he's blessing Yehudah, and he talks about Yehudah being the king, he also throws in this comment, the scepter shall not leave the hand of Yehudah. And you have to wonder, is he talking about this, giving up the seal and cord and staff here, where it did leave his hand? All right. So he returned to Yehudah. Oops, did I miss a verse? Yes, okay. 19, so she went on her way, she took off her veil and put on again her widow's garb. Yehudah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite. This Hira guy is a good friend of Yehudah, does all the dirty work, to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he couldn't find her. He inquired of that town, where's the cult prostitute, the one at Anayim by the road? But they said there's been no prostitute here. Now this is also interesting in the Hebrew. Until now, Yehudah had referred to Tamar as a zona, which means prostitute. That's the word we saw a couple of verses ago. But here they're asking about, where is it here? They're asking about, if you can see my cursor here, or my mouse thingy. He's looking for a Kadesha. So a Kadesha, which they translate in the English here as a cult prostitute. So as one of the many religions going on there, one of the Avodah Zarah religions going on there, more or less, there were prostitutes that worked, I don't know, for the god or for the whatever Avodah Zarah they were doing. But that kind of person that kind of woman was a bit more respectable than just your regular zona who's a total prostitute. And so what's interesting here is that, well, that's why they didn't. So they're asking around, have you seen this Kadesha? Have you seen this Kadesha? And of course, the answer is, well, no, we haven't seen a Kadesha. They might have seen a zona if they had asked for a zona, which was a prostitute. The Kadesha is more respectable here. So he returned to Yehudah, said, I couldn't find her. Moreover, the townspeople said, there's been no prostitute here. Again, they're using the word Kadesha. There's been no Kadesha here. So that gives the impression that he wasn't particularly looking very hard for her. And then in verse 23, it sort of gives away the story here. Yehudah said, well, let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I did send her the kid, but you did not find her. So, and now we know the reason why. Yehudah doesn't want it known that he gave his cord, seal, and staff just to sleep with a zona. Maybe for a Kadesha, that might be okay, maybe not the best thing, but for a zona, chas v'shalom. So Yehudah is, Yehudah, in the very first pasuk we talked about, Yehudah was going down. So we can see here, morality-wise and in his actions, yes, he is going down. So of course, this seems to happen a lot in stories and fairy tales, and not to equate fairy tales with Torah. I shouldn't have said that, but it happens a lot when we read about other places. It doesn't happen so much in real life. So of course, she got pregnant right away. One time she got pregnant. About 3 months later, Yehudah was told, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. And there they're using the word zona again. In fact, she is pregnant by harlotry, by her zona stuff. Bring her out and let her be burned, says Yehudah. So if Yehudah has gone down, he has hit rock bottom right now. Think about let's zoom out and look at the big picture here. He's lost 2 sons. His third one is unmarried. He's missing his identity. His staff, cord, and seal are gone. And now he's about to have his own daughter-in-law and unborn child or children burned. This is the nadir of his life, and in a sense, it's the rock bottom of the lives of all the children of Israel. note the clear parallel to the entire family. So Yosef is presumed dead, right? Yaakov thinks Yosef is dead. The brothers have lied to their father, who can't be comforted, which we read in which appears in chapter 37. And two of his brothers have slaughtered an entire town, Shechem. Yaakov, who is supposed to be the patriarch of all the children of Israel, that's why we are called the children of Israel, has totally lost control over what's going on with his descendants. And I'm going to end right there. I'm going to end on the cliffhanger. I hope you noted that this was part one. So I needed to make sure that you'll come back for part two. So I end on that cliffhanger. And in fact, if this were a movie, this is the perfect place for the commercial, because it's like, in my mind, I picture this movie where it's like dun dun dun, and the whole flashbacks are going through. Well, actually, there's another part. Flashbacks are going through what's going on, what's about to happen. So that will all be in part two, that I promise will come. That God willing, we'll explain it all and tie it all together with some really cool stuff in part two. So I'm going to stop the recording right now, and you can ask questions. If anybody has any questions, I'll talk about a future schedule.